Ok, salut! On se retrouve aujourd'hui pour une nouvelle vidéo. Et pour cette vidéo, c'est un petit, disons, résumé de, comment je vais dire ça, de ce qu'on va avoir avant Snezhnaya. Normalement, bon, sur le dernier live stream, ils ont dit Snezhnaya 12 août. Je sais pas si c'est le live stream qui est le 12 août, mais si c'est la version. Mais si c'est la version qui sort, normalement, d'ici la semaine prochaine, on doit avoir le live stream de la version 7.0. Et je compte le regarder peut-être en live. Il y a 3 chances sur 4 que je regarde en live sur YouTube. Mais le plus important, c'est d'avoir la tête fraîche de la nouvelle région. Du coup, je me suis fait une petite compilation de vidéos françaises et anglaises. Même si j'en ai pas l'air, je regarde mes vidéos en anglais. Je parle pas vraiment anglais pour autant. Mais en tout cas, je comprends. Je comprends, peut-être c'est pas dit qui est compliqué. Passons, mettons ça à côté. Du coup, j'ai fait ma petite compilation et on va regarder ensemble. Du coup, ne tardons pas plus. N'oubliez pas de laisser un petit pouce bleu, de vous abonner et de laisser un commentaire. Ça fait très plaisir. Et merci pour la vidéo de la quête Moongazer qui est arrivée à 340 vues. Je ne m'attendais pas à ce qu'une vidéo fasse autant de vues. Mais on y va. Dans la liste, on a l'histoire complète, la timeline complète de Teyvat et Genshin, le lore de Genshin expliqué, tous les exécuteurs fatoués expliqués, les différents types de niveaux. Je sais pas qu'on les appelait comme ça en français. Moi, désolé. Moi, je les appelais faits. Ensuite, ensuite, nous avons tout ce que nous savons de la Tsaritsa, du projet Stougia et de Snezhnaya. Ça, c'est un peu lore et théorie. Ensuite, peut-être je devais enlever ça. On va garder. Et mais si je vois si ça va trop en théorie, je vais peut-être enlever. Les 25 éléments on a raté dans le trailer de Transcendance. Et ensuite, Transcendance trailer, lore, analysis et théorie. C'est de Mindself. Mindself, je sais pas si c'est comme ça on prononce. Mais elle est très connue pour ses lore vidéo. Donc, je me disais que je devais regarder aussi. Et c'est quoi le mot? J'ai oublié le mot, mais. Et bien évidemment, voilà, bien évidemment, ou bien disons naturellement, vous trouverez les liens de toutes ces vidéos en description, parce qu'il faut évidemment donner le crédit au créateur de ces vidéos, bien évidemment. Bon, sans plus tarder, allons-y avec la première vidéo. Je place mon modèle. Je vais le mettre un peu gros par rapport aux fois où j'ai fait le gameplay. Un peu sur la gauche. Ok.
The entire story and timeline of Genshin Impact simplified. Well, sort of. We're gonna go into depth on what happened in every nation
Je vais
during
essayer de
every time
commenter même si je
period,
suis pas
the
très fort
more
pour le
influential
commentaire.
characters leading up to our current game and nod cry in 6.1. But it is going to be straightforward, easy to follow, focusing on the main plot points because obviously Genshin's lore and story is very convoluted, An actual timeline touching on every single character, their history could take hours. So this is going to be my somewhat simplified, complete timeline start to finish of Genshin Impact.
Ok.
In the ancient times of
Avant qu'on continue, sachez que cette vidéo sera divisée en plusieurs parties. Parce que ça fait à peu près 4 heures de contenu. Donc, je vais diviser en plusieurs parties. Cette vidéo fait 45 minutes. Je vais diviser ça, ces deux vidéos en première. Ensuite, on aura ces deux vidéos en deuxième vidéo. Et la troisième vidéo sera pour les 3 dernières. Je pense que c'est une bonne répartition.
Teyvat lived the dragons, an incredibly smart and advanced race, even building spaceships
Oui,
and
on a bien
traveling
vu à quel
beyond
point ils sont
Teyvat.
intelligents.
The leader among them, Nibelung the Dragon King, along with his 7
Avec la
sovereigns, the
lune de la
dragons
mort
being
qu'ils
of
ont
the light
faite.
realm, and the main elemental beings of Teyvat.
J'ai sauté
Being
quelque
of the
chose.
light realm, Nibelung the Dragon King, along with his 7 sovereigns, the dragons being of the light realm, and the main elemental beings of Teyvat. Nibelung then created 3 moons and 3 gods corresponding with them to uphold the laws and nature of Teyvat. Then a mysterious voyager and outsider came to Teyvat and made friends with the dragons and the Dragon King.
L'ordre
Then once
divin.
the voyager left, a mysterious first descender descended upon Teyvat, creating 4 shining shades in Dragon King.
Ça, c'est quelque
Voyager
chose
and
que je sais pas.
outsider hold the long then created 3 moons and 3 gods corresponding with them to uphold the laws and nature of Teyvat. Then a mysterious voyager and outsider came to Teyvat and made friends with the dragons and the Dragon King. Then once the
Ça, je savais pas. Je viens de rentrer dans la vidéo, il y a déjà une information que j'ai pas. Je vais faire ma petite recherche. Bon, je suis allé sur le wiki. On dit il a rencontré ce terrevorien, un voyageur qui a traversé la mer des étoiles. Chroniquement, la chute d'une civilisation. Elle a mis, je sais pas traduit en direct, un voyageur de la mer des étoiles. En relatant la disparition de civilisations, elle a averti que son monde était destiné à la destruction par les abysses et l'exhorta à partir avec elle. Pourtant, Nibelung a refusé d'abandonner ses proches. Au lieu de cela, il a cherché à mener la race des dragons au-delà de Teyvat, en développant les moyens d'atteindre l'ambition star qui a donné naissance à leur maîtrise technologique avancée. Oh, donc c'est pour ça, puisqu'il est représenté dans la décision murale, il est possible que le projet d'ascenseur spatial soit sur lui et un autre, ce qui sort, initialement dirigé par Nibelung. Oh, ce théorie. Ça, c'est dans le truc de Nicole, non? Oui. Ce théorie aussi connu sous l'apôtre du Grand Nord, du Nord lointain, était un voyageur de la mer des étoiles qui a imité le corps d'un jeune inconnu de l'ère Hyperborea et plus tard sera connu comme l'époux de Khaenri'ah. Je suis nul en l'art. Comment il y a des trucs comme ça, j'ai raté. Je vais lire un peu et puis on va retourner sur les vidéos dans une seconde. Ok, j'ai lu un peu et il semblerait que ce soit dans une quête de notre Grail que je n'ai pas encore faite. Sur le premier ange. Au moins ça me met quelque chose sur la liste des quêtes à faire. Bon, retournons sur la vidéo.
The Voyager left, a mysterious first descender descended upon Teyvat, creating 4 shining shades and shadows of themselves, representing life, death, space, and time, battled the dragons and defeated them. Nibelung would then leave to get help from the Abyss to defeat the usurpers. This mysterious person would be known as the Primordial One, and then would tailor-make Teyvat to cater to humanity, and humanity would prosper under the rule of the angels and Celestia under the Primordial One. Humans were very content living peaceful, ignorant lives, until they started asking questions about the outside world, forbidden knowledge. Then they started to piss off the heavenly principles, which met with divine wrath. All the while, the dragons have been stewing, pissed off about being usurped and losing their planet. So they started forming kinship with the humans, who also now felt segregated. The Moon Sisters that were created by the Dragon King to serve the dragons were forced to side then with the heavenly principles once they usurped, which pissed off the dragons. This mysterious Voyager would return, wondering what the hell happened to Teyvat. Everything's so strict now. Disguising themselves as a human, fell in love with one of the angels, who were also starting to question their role in all this and their purpose of being created to guide and govern over humanity. This led them to creating a new race in Hyperborea, a secret civilization. Then Nibelung came back with
Quelle nouvelle
forbidden knowledge
race.
heavily corrupted by the Abyss, which pretty much plagued Teyvat, and they went to war again with the heavenly principles, which the dragons and the sovereigns, biding their time, joined the fray.
Excusez-moi, mais ils doivent nous faire une liste dans le jeu des quêtes monde importantes. Parce que je viens de découvrir une quête que je connaissais pas, qui en fait raconte toute la genèse de Teyvat au moment des dragons. Et une quête comme ça, comment ils peuvent ne pas écrire quelque part? Peut-être ils ont écrit quelque part et c'est moi qui ne le sais pas. C'est aussi une option.
Hey, seeing how corrupted his old friend was, though, this mysterious Voyager had to side with the heavenly principles, leading to a war so catastrophic that it pretty much wiped out everything and everyone in Teyvat, permanently scarring the land, and the heavenly principles having to cast down the divine nails. Sumeru used to be covered in a rainforest, but led to it being a desert, and Dragonspine becoming a cold, desolate mountain. And because they felt betrayed by the Moon Sisters, they killed 2 of them along with their moons, and the 3rd Moon Sister was killed, but their moon left dormant, but still intact.
Je me demande encore pourquoi ils ont laissé une lune intacte, alors qu'ils ont détruit jusqu'à 2 lunes. Ou bien ils ont besoin de la lune pour quelque chose.
Teyvat barely survived this war, but now that the dragons were permanently defeated, the heavenly principles initiated a new world order, inciting the gods and long-life species in Teyvat to fight for a gnosis, carved from the remains of the 3rd descender, and visions to be distributed to worthy individuals that could uphold Teyvat, protect it now from the Abyss and external threats. Basically like an incentive and reward system for being good. And
Donc les visions, les œils divins sont un moyen de contrôler et aussi de créer un moyen de défense contre
living
l'abysse.
the way the heavenly principles wants you to live. This led to the Archon War that only ended 2,000 years ago before the game's events. In Mondstadt, there was a dictator god that lived in the capital,
De
Ikaraban,
Carabian.
the god of storms. Mondstadt was a winterly, desolate place. A little wind
Dragon
spirit would
Spy.
inherit the powers of Istaroth, and after a huge rebellion and war, they would overthrow the god of storms, and this little wind spirit would take on the form of a bard, being known as Venti, becoming the first and only ever Animo Archon with the Animo Gnosis. After the god of storms was defeated, Venti terraformed the land so that Mondstadt was now a lush, green, fertile land, not a cold, desolate winter place. While Venti was busy terraforming Mondstadt, an icy, snowy mountain known as Palos Peak got nearly completely buried by Venti's Animo powers, with only the peak of it being visible to this day,
Ah
known
bon?
now as Musk Reef. The people then abandoned the capital of Mondstadt, which is now known as Storm Terror's lair, and formed a new capital city in Cider Lake, with a nice cathedral built at the top and a statue of their new animal Archon. Venti was a very lenient Archon, not intervening with his people too much, allowing them true freedom. This worked out okay for the most part, but then around 1,000 years ago, all the rich people of Mondstadt banded together to form an aristocracy, belittling the lower class and even taking slaves. And unfortunately for some wanderers from Natlan that escaped Natlan, they were taken captive to fight in the gladiator pits. But because they're from Natlan, the nation of war, they dominated the gladiator ring, Vanessa being the most renowned of all of them, until she stood up to the nobles in Venti's honor, not even knowing it's the animal Archon, and they forced her to fight Ursa the Drake, which she defeated, and then it started a rebellion overthrowing the rich nobles. And Vanessa founding and becoming the first ever Grand Master of the Knights of Favonius, later ascending to Celestia to become one of the Four Winds, the Falcon of the West. Also a group of exceptionally powerful witches with long lifespans, well, most of them, and the founding member of this group, Alice, forms a group known as the Hegsen Circle, which is German for Coven of Witches. They challenge the authority of the animal Archon, but instead he invites them to share drinks. And from this day forward, there would be an alliance between the witches, the animal Archon, and whoever is the current Grand Master of Mondstadt to protect Mondstadt, but also Teyvat and its borders. In Liyue, a bunch of Adepti would band together under one mysterious Omega Adepti, named Rex Lapis, who would be undefeated in the Archon War, defeating many gods in his path, making Rex Lapis the oldest and only ever Geo-Archon. They resided within the Gilly Plains, I can't remember the name of it, this place in Liyue. Then it got flooded out, hence all the water now. Around this time the Stove God shrunk down and went into hibernation mode. Rex Lapis and the other Adepti would then go on to create Liyue Harbor, which would become the central hub of Liyue and their trading. Humans would eventually take over Liyue, while the Adepti would take a back seat, until eventually the Adepti completely went into isolation, to the point where humans don't even see them anymore, keeping to themselves while humans took over Liyue. One of the many gods Rex Lapis killed in the Archon War was a giant serpent-like dragon, one of the more powerful ones he fought, which was actually Zhao's former master. Zhao being so grateful for Rex Lapis granting his freedom, he remains loyal to Rex Lapis to this day. And because Rex Lapis killed so many gods during the Archon War, and their remains plagued the land, he formed his own suicide squad called the Yakshas to help deal with this problem and corruption, which ultimately led to all the Yakshas going mad in one way or another, with Zhao being the only one left. He almost succumbed to the madness himself, but Venti saved his life. In Inazuma, there were twin gods, Raiden A and Raiden Mei. Raiden A and Raiden Makoto. Raiden A was exceptionally strong and powerful, while Raiden Makoto, not as strong, was a way better leader and delegator. So the twin gods would become the Electro Archons. But outside of a very few select people, because they were twins, everyone just assumed they were the same being, just one individual. Do you remember all those ancient civilizations we just talked about under the primordial one? Well, one of those civilizations survived, but they got sunken into the abyss, known as Enkanomiya, where they continued to survive. They got harassed by a god known as the Dragonair of the Depths, until Orobashi fled Chenyu Vale not to get slaughtered by Rex Lapis in his campaign. Orobashi would free the people of Enkanomiya, read the book Before Sun and Moon, and learn about the old world. Then he was sentenced to death by Celestia. He would take the descendants of Enkanomiya, creating a new island known as Watatsumi Island. But because he was sentenced to death and did not want his new civilization to feel that wrath along with him, he went and attacked Yashiori Island and was eventually slain by the Raiden Shogun and her legendary sword, the Muto no Minotachi. After Orobashi died, his skeleton can be seen there to this day. The people of Watatsumi refused to acknowledge the Raiden Shogun after their god was killed. and the people of Watatsumi feel that way to this day. One silver lining is their dead deity now Orobashi's remains caused the island of Yashiori to be plagued and corrupted, much like the dead gods the Yaksha try to deal with. The shogunate forces tried to establish strongholds
je n'ai même
and
pas pensé à
encampments
ça,
on
que
this
lui aussi il
island,
était un
but it
dieu.
led to everyone going mad
C'est
and
pour ça
killing
une
each other.
personne habite
So
là-bas.
Yashiori Island acts as a perfect no man's land between the two armies. In Sumeru, there were 3 god kings, King Deshert, Rukkhadevata, and Nabu, the goddess of flowers. Nabu, being from the angel race banished from the old world, knew the secrets and history of Teyvat and told King Deshert. King Deshert was picked by Celestia to be the Archon but refused, choosing to instead rebel, learning about the old world and the fake power they were offering him. Both Nabu and Deshert would die in their attempt to rebel, leaving Rukkhadevata no choice but to save the desert. The corruption and forbidden knowledge King Deshert brought forced Rukkhadevata to isolate the rainforest and then expel her power, saving the desert people, forcing her to be in a shrunken down state and become the first Dendro Archon. Rukkhadevata would save the people of the desert, but the academia and their misinformation campaign would spin this, and the truth would get buried in the sand,
Toujours
no
pour
pun
de la
intended,
propagande.
so that the people of the desert felt that Rukkhadevata favored the people of the rainforest and killed their deity, causing a lot of strife between the rainforest and desert people that remains to this day. Rukkhadevata also created some little creatures known as the Aranara to help her govern and rule over Sumeru. In Fontaine, the Hydro Sovereign died in the Great War, so the Shade of Life needed to replace the heart of the Primordial Sea in order to safeguard Teyvat, so they created the first ever Oceanid, Egeria, who would then become the first ever Hydro Archon, and would go on to create many more who would guard Shade of Life through. In Fontaine, the Hydro Sovereign died in the Great War, so the Shade of Life needed to replace the heart of the Primordial Sea in order to safeguard Teyvat, so they created the first ever Oceanid, Egeria, who would then become the first ever Hydro Archon, and would go on to create many more Oceanids that would populate Fontaine. These Oceanids would then plead to Egeria they wanted to become humans and experience humanity. She thought to herself, sure, I don't see why not. Then the Heavenly Principles went, nope, now Fontaine and everyone that lives there doomed, with an awful prophecy that will come to fruition one day with the flooding of Fontaine and the destruction of everyone living there. It should also be noted too that before Egeria was even created, there was a god king named Remus who was originally from Sumeru, but his land was conquered by the powerful King Deshert. So he fled to Fontaine and established a nation known as Remoria, being the first ever historical capital of Fontaine. A place that prospered under freedom and a lot of drinking, partying, and songs, let's be honest. But he tried to prevent Fontaine's inevitable prophesized destruction, with his Grand Symphony trying to grant his people eternal life, elevating their souls and minds into golems. But ultimately his plan failed, and Remoria is found at the depths of the ocean to this day. In Natlan, the dragons were still very prevalent, having their secret hidden civilizations, along with Shukatl, the Pyro Sovereign, that after the War of Vengeance was extremely corrupted by the Abyss and started laying waste to Natlan's ley lines. In order to save Natlan, an exceptional hero and human named Xbalanque battled Shukatl and defeated the dragons, stabbing their eye out in the volcano, but would die in the process, but would be resurrected by the Shade of Death, Renova. With Natlan having such severely damaged ley lines, which would allow the Abyss to have a huge presence in Natlan, the only way for this nation to survive was for Xbalanque and the Shade of Death to make a deal. Humans would become Archons one by one, and the Sacred Flame would allow humans and heroes of Natlan to be resurrected if they win the war, keeping Natlan safe in a constant battle and war with the Abyss, which would last for generations until the current game's events. The Shade of Death would task one of her underling angels, I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name, the Lord of Night, angels.
You te contain Lord of the Night.
I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name, the Lord of Night, to help construct the Night Kingdom to act as Natlan's ley lines, which would serve this purpose until this very day. The dragon sage that Shukato left in charge of the dragon civilization was impeached by the 13 dragon lords after he introduced phlogiston to the primitive humans in order to undermine Celestia. He also created Ochcan, who was his son, a half-dragon, half-human, intending for him to unite the humans and dragons
Mais
to
c'est lui qui
rise
était le
and
tyran,
fight
si je
the
me
throne
rappelle.
of the heavens as one. Ochcan Natlan was then established by Xbalanque, but once he became Pyro Archon, the king of Ochcan Natlan fell to Ochcan himself, who was friends with the first Pyro Archon. But Ochcan eventually betrays his buddy, becomes a tyrant, and obsessed with killing dragons. Not what his old man had planned for him whatsoever. But the human that would become the second Pyro Archon after Xbalanque would eventually overthrow Ochcan, with Ochcan's mind and body being split in half. One in the dragon of the city of flowing ash, and the other, I'm not going to pronounce that, but it's this little guy. But essentially, because the Natlan Pyro Archon is just a human with a human lifespan, there were a ton of Pyro Archons over the coming years, leading up to the Cataclysm 500 years ago. In Snezhnaya, they would have the first Cryo Archon Belizar that would inherit that role in the Cryognosis until they would be succeeded by the Tsaritsa. And in recent books and Nodcry, they hint towards an arranged marriage between a descender and the Tsaritsa. Once the Archon War was over 2,000 years before the game starts, Teyvat would somewhat prosper under pretty normal times, while an underground godless nation named Khaenri'ah would form, finding ways to harness the power of the Crimson Moon, able to harness many powers from outside Teyvat, technology and different scientific achievements gathered from outside Teyvat, harness the power of the Abyss, and so much more. This includes summoning Outlanders from outside Teyvat, which includes us, the main characters, one of which would stay dormant in their spaceship while our Abyss twin would integrate into Khaenri'ah civilization, becoming a well-known and important person within Khaenri'ah. It should also be noted too that even mere humans were very exceptional in Khaenri'ah, reaching heights of strength and prestige that was definitely forbidden by the heavenly principles. But among them, 5 of these individuals stood out amongst the rest, who want to become even more powerful than the heavenly principles, transcending this world, which is highly forbidden. And when Dainslift's older brother Vedalfonir had his eyes gouged out by the king of Khaenri'ah and was placed into prison 500 years ago, the other 4 sinners broke him out of jail but succumbed to the abyss that the king had already been corrupted by, indulging in their greatest desires, which would ultimately doom Khaenri'ah and bring on the Cataclysm, a catastrophe in which the world has never seen. The abyss and its monsters would run amok in every single nation simultaneously, causing untold destruction and damage. This nation went under everyone's nose for far too long, causing the Cataclysm 500 years ago, forcing the heavenly principles, the Archons, and all the manpower of Celestia and Teyvat to take down this nation, with many innocent humans in Khaenri'ah getting caught in the crosshairs, the pure-blooded Khaenri'ans being cursed with immortality, while the non-purebloods would be cursed with the wilderness, becoming hilly trolls and monsters. Then a group of them would slowly form the Abyss Order, while another pure-blooded Khaenri'an, angry at the heavenly principles, would align with the Tsaritsa, the Cryo Archon, and form a group known as the Fatui, with 11 powerful generals known as the Fatui Harbingers. The heavenly principles would be weakened and dormant from this day forward. Now, before we can continue in the timeline, how did the Cataclysm affect each nation? In Mondstadt, we'll talk more about Dvalin, but he fought a dragon Durin, was corrupted, and many knights died fighting the monsters, but ultimately Mondstadt was pretty unscathed. In Liyue, it was similar to Mondstadt, a lot of monsters. There was many millilith casualties fighting these monsters, and heavy abyssal corruption and monsters in the chasm, with one of the Yaksha sacrificing themselves.
Ils ont dit que, si je ne me trompe pas, il y a une quête qui montre que la porte vers Khaenri'ah est en dessous de Sumeru. Dans ce cas, est-ce que ça devrait pas être Sumeru devait être touché le plus.
Themselves to keep the abyss at bay, preventing the corruption spreading from the depths. The cataclysm hit Inazuma pretty hard, there were many casualties, and the nation suffered greatly. Raiden Makoto, the current Archon, went to fight the Abyss in Sumeru, along with many of the other Archons where Raiden A stayed back in Inazuma. In the epic battle against Khaenri'ah and its monsters, Raiden Makoto was slain, leading to Raiden
Je me
A
demande c'est
losing her sister and many of her
qui a
friends
réussi à
along the
tuer
way.
Makoto.
Not feeling fit to rule with PTSD, she would create a puppet to rule in her stead. First creating a puppet with emotions and free will, but would ultimately set this puppet free, which would, probably not but definitely will, come back to bite everyone in the ass later. Then she would perfect her design, and then ultimately this puppet would go on to be a pretty big dictator. Also, Raiden A was able to plant a sacred Sakura, the great tree helping keep the Abyss at bay in the future, to help them in the past. Through the power of time and Istaroth playing a hand at this. In Sumeru, forbidden knowledge spread like pollution, and it greatly affected the tree of Irminsul. Irminsul acts as like Teyvat's brain, the center of everything. This being corrupted would have ultimately led to the destruction of Teyvat as we know it, since we know Irminsul connects to everyone. Through memories, neurologically, through their minds, it would have been devastating, so Ruka Devada sacrificed herself to stop that from happening, with one of her last acts taking a remaining pure branch uncorrupted from Irminsul, creating the new Dendral Archon, Lesser Lord Kusanali. Unfortunately, she could not get rid of every little bit of corruption, and this lingering corruption would cause a phenomenon within Sumeru known as the Withering. In Fontaine, a massive dragon from outside Teyvat Ilia appears and attacks the population.
Ah bon?
They were ultimately able to defeat
Je me suis
the
jamais
dragon,
posé
which
la
led to
question
the
sur...
birth of creatures known as Melusines, which would slowly be integrated into Fontaine
Je
society.
connaissais
The
pas le lore des
Melusines were
Mélusines.
discriminated against at first, but now people really enjoy their company. While this is happening, the first Hydro Archon Aegeria, also fighting in Sumeru, was killed as well during the Cataclysm in the Great Battle. Ruka Devada anchoring her life force to the land, making the great tree we see today. Many Oceanids would then leave Fontaine, not wanting to follow Focalors, the new Hydro Archon, like Rodadia of Locke that can be found near Chitsa village in Liyue. Natlan was the nation most heavily affected by the Abyss. The current human that ascended to be the Pyro Archon, Mavwika, from the scions of the Canopy tribe, had to devise a plan along with the heroes of that era, and they were successfully able to repel the abyssal invasion, but it led to everyone dying except for Mavwika. But she devised a plan, being able to be resurrected 500 years later in current game to continue her fight. Al-Istaroth, the Shade of Time, and potentially the Shade of Space Asmodee orchestrated our Abyss sibling, us, in the future while Khaenri'ah is being destroyed, effectively guaranteeing they would miss the Cataclysm, creating a paradox within Teyvat. But our past selves along with our past sibling would then try to escape Teyvat, being abrupted and stopped and imprisoned by the Shade of Space, Asmodee, sending our sibling down to Teyvat while we are imprisoned for 500 years. Our Abyss sibling goes on an epic journey with Dainsleif until they have a falling out. And then our Abyss sibling joins forces with the Abyss Order, devising a plan to form the Loom of Fate, building an atlas for Khaenri'ah to recreate the underground nation. Sometime before we discover Paimon and begin our journey, Sertologi, one of those powerful 5 sinners, has gotten way more powerful outside Teyvat, even having his own disciple named Skirk, who was a survivor of her home world that was destroyed. He trains Skirk to fight, and tells her that one day he will challenge and kill her along with everyone she holds dear if she does not get more powerful so she can be a challenge for him. She then crosses over the borders of Teyvat and runs into Alice, who safeguards Teyvat's borders and regulates who comes in and out. She then journeys across Teyvat, even discovering the old, forgotten civilization of Hyperborea, with their current descendants, the Frostmoon Scions, residing within Nodcry. and then eventually she trains a young boy from Snezhnaya named Ajax, who would become Tartaglia, the 11th Fatui Harbinger. 500 years later, we awaken, and while we're fishing for some food, catch Paimon, who is drowning in the ocean, in Liyue in the Stone Forest. We then tell Paimon our story about being trapped, and start our epic quest to... We then tell Paimon in the ocean, in Liyue in the Stone
Je savais pas.
Forest. We then tell Paimon our story about being trapped, and start our epic quest to regain our memories and find our lost sibling. As we venture into Mondstadt, coming into contact with our first statue of the Seven, realizing we can harness the elements. We then stumble upon the Anemo Archon and Dvalin, one of the Four Winds, who is basically now sick and corrupted from battling a dragon named Durin on Dragonspine. A dragon created by one of the Five Sinners. You remember one of those Five Sinners? The one known as Rhindaughter that loved to create monsters using abyssal powers and alchemy, fuses with the Shade of Life, Naberius, but not before creating a super being known as Albedo, also capable of great feats of alchemy and creation. She gives Albedo to Alice and the Knights of Avonius, Albedo acting as a big brother to Klee. Dvalin now being hostile and attacking the citizens of Mondstadt, while the Fatui try to regain influence in the city of Mondstadt. Grandmaster Varka takes 80% of the Knights of Favonius' manpower, leaving Jean Gunhilder as the acting Grand Master with 20% of their manpower left to deal with the situation. We are able to foil the Abyss Order's plans, weaponizing Dvalin and cure Dvalin of his abyssal corruption, but not before La Signora, the 8th Fatui Harbinger, ambushes us and takes Venti's Gnosis. La Signora was just a maiden in Mondstadt 500 years ago, but her lover, a knight of Favonius, Rostam, was killed during the Cataclysm, and she blames Venti. If the 7 Archons are the 7 deadly sins, then Venti is definitely the sin of sloth. She blames him for not doing anything and went down a dark path, becoming the Crimson Witch of Flames. She was also a prodigy at the Sumero Academia. This is why she hates Venti, and this is personal for her. And that's why Venti had to catch these hands. Oh, shit! A man named Dainsliff shows up in Mondstadt, basically telling us that he hates the gods and telling us the Abyss Order's plan to steal the eye of the first field killer for their plans of the Loom of Fate. We find a defiled statue of the Seven, where we meet the Abyss Princess, our mysterious lost sibling, who of course gives us a cryptic message about going on our journey to learn the truth. Can you be any more cryptic? Then we head on over to Liyue, where we go to celebrate their Archon in Liyue Harbor, and Rex Lapis is basically assassinated right away. But not really though. Actually, Rex Lapis is starting to suffer from something called erosion, which is basically dementia for gods, potentially making him dangerous in the future, and he wants to retire. The Tsaritsa and her 11 Harbingers by now already devised their plan to collect every Gnosis for their ambitious plan to overthrow Celestia and their upcoming project called Project Stuja, while they simultaneously set up a huge base in Nodcry, a sub-nation of Snezhnaya, to harness the power of the moon. And let's be honest, they don't even want to attempt Rex Lapis's Geonosis by force, but they make a deal. The Tsaritsa wants his Gnosis and he wants to retire, but he wants to make sure his nation can survive without him. The Adepti used to run Liyue, but now the humans do. The Adepti kinda took a back seat and secluded themselves. He needs to bring them together, so now he hides in disguise as Zhongli, and basically starts planning his own funeral. And he's broke as a joke. We go visit the Adepti and tell him what happens. Naturally, the Adepti are pissed off and assume the worst in humanity. Tartaglia is tricked by La Signora to revive Osial, a god Rex Lapis defeated in the Archon War. The Adepti and humans all come together along with the Traveler to save the day, proving to Zhongli that they can survive without him. And as promised, he gives up his Geonosis, and Tartaglia is pissed off learning he was used. The pure-blooded Khaenri'ah Piero and the Lord Commander of the Fatui and the Harbingers sends his 6th Harbinger Scaramouche to kill the Traveler and investigate the falling stars, which are actual
Ah, ça
people's
c'était un event,
fates
non?
and constellations literally falling from the sky. Because Teyvat is like a giant program, Scaramouche then gets sidetracked realizing he's probably in a giant simulation this whole time and the sky is fake. We then go to Inazuma. Well, actually, we're
Je
smuggled into
savais pas
Inazuma
qu'il
with an
racontait tout ça dans
already
une event
escaped
comme ça.
convict and refugee Kazuha because Inazuma's in an all-out decree and dictatorship. Remember that crazy puppet that I told you the Raiden Shogun made? Well, it's been confiscating visions to uphold its program of eternity. The Sakoku decree was so strict that Inazuma's borders were completely sealed, and everyone's confiscated visions were placed for all to see, except for the beings of Watatsumi Island. They still hate the Raiden Shogun and refused to give up their visions. So the most loyal to the Raiden Shogun of the Triforce Commissions, the Kujo clan, went to war with the residents of Watatsumi and their leader Sagonomiya Kokomi, while we ally ourselves with the Yashiori Commission and their leaders Kamisato Ayato and Ayaka. We eventually challenge the Raiden Shogun directly, but naturally we lose this, joining forces with Watatsumi but learning that the Fatui Harbingers have been orchestrating this conflict from behind the scenes, taking advantage of the strife and war, with her long-abandoned puppet Scaramouche running the Delusion Factory, while La Signora goes to negotiate with the Shogun directly. But her ego and pride gets in the way as she accepts a challenge from us directly. Going by Inazuma law and tradition, La Signora is defeated and then slain by the Raiden Shogun puppet, with Yaimiko and the rest of the resistance in Inazuma all banding together to help Raiden A snap out of her funk and reclaim her rightful place as Archon of Inazuma, sidelining her puppet, but her puppet would still have its programming, so we would ultimately still have to deal with it, leaving Inazuma in a state of recovery, but in a much better place. When we arrive in Sumeru, the entire place is filled with uncertainty and conspiracy. The people there are slowly suffering more and more from this corruption of Irminsul and this phenomenon known as the Withering, and people like Tegnari are doing their best to try to keep it at bay, while the sages give everyone this fancy headpiece, giving everybody Wi-Fi in Sumeru to hijack their dreams and create a 3-day samsara. As the academia corrupted over time, the new Dendro Archon Nahida, Lesser Lord Kusanali, was imprisoned and basically forgotten by her people. They refused to accept her as the new Dendro Archon, and the sages of the academia would rule over Sumeru, being manipulated by the Fatui Harbinger known as the Doctor, who was expelled from the academia many years ago. They would plot to replace Nahida with a man-made god, with Scaramouche and his electronosis being the basis of this experiment, to help fix the decaying Irminsul and the corruption of knowledge. Ultimately, we're able to uncover the truth of this, with the help of our new friends in Sumeru that already speculated that the academia was corrupt, like Alhaitham and Sino, who acts as the academia's muscle, which leads to an epic battle with a nearly completed false god, securing the electronosis, and in order to cleanse the corruption left in Irminsul, Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, what was left of her, not only completely erases herself, but erases her entire legacy and memory, so nobody in Teyvat would ever remember who she was. Since Irminsul was corrupted and she was the old avatar of Irminsul, naturally she was corrupted along with it. I guess when you have to do a complete factory reset, it is what it is. But the current Dendro Archon would negotiate the two Gnosis with the Doctor for secrets of Teyvat, after which she would rehabilitate the 6th Fatui Harbinger and the Shogun puppet Scaramouche, erasing him from Irminsul and allowing him a fresh start.
Récemment, j'ai vu que ici, il essuyait du sang sur son visage. Juste là. Quand je jouais, j'avais jamais fait attention.
But because the traveler is a descender and not tethered to the land, naturally we remember Rukkhadevata and we help Nahida remember as well. We then meet a pure-blooded Khaenri'ah cursed with immortality named Clothar, who fell in love with a woman from Mondstadt 500 years ago, having a son named Caliber. Unfortunately, when they were cursed, his son got the curse of the wilderness. This led to Clothar founding the Abyss Order, with our Abyss siblings still being the prince or princess, but he went mad about 100 years ago and then eventually disappeared. We then head on over to Fontaine, who still has the prophesized demise hanging over their heads, and the water levels have been rising every year, and there's a lot of tension in Fontaine. 500 years ago, Focalors, one of the most exceptional Oceanids under Egeria, became the new Hydro Archon. But in order to save everyone from this flood, she devised a plan. The plan is to destroy the very concept of the Hydro Archon and their divine throne, returning the power to the original rulers, the Sovereigns, and the new reincarnated Hydro Sovereign Neuvillette. But in order to do this, she needs to accumulate energy in the Oratrice, used in the courtroom of Fontaine. But in order to prevent Celestia from realizing that Focalors is basically working on screwing them over, she divides herself in half, separating herself into her human form and her divine form, with her human form being Farina having to act and pretend to be the Hydro Archon now for the next 500 years, which effectively works for the most part, except for a few people being suspicious. While in the Fortress of Meripede, an exceptional warden puts all the convicts to work for something good in creating a giant ship in case the prophecy does come true. Also doing their best to keep the Primordial Sea at base, since the Primordial Sea will actually dissolve all the people from Fontaine, since remember, the people from Fontaine are actually Oceanids, not human. Once Neuvillette has his full power and authority restored by Focalors after she sacrifices herself, he then turns the people of Fontaine into real humans now. And the flood still quote-unquote happens in the eyes of Celestia, but not before smacking around the all-devouring Narwhal, which is a creature from outside Teyvat, possibly related to the Leviathans from Honkai Star Rail, we have no idea. Sertologi that now resides outside Teyvat.
Léviathan en Kaistarel. Je vois pas beaucoup d'images.
Teyvat kept this thing as a pet, and it breached Teyvat, so we had to deal with it, and then Skirk yeets it and Child through a portal and tells us about the Gnosis and how they're the remains of the third Descender. We then run into our Abyss sibling who's trying to create an atlas to recreate Khaenri'ah through the ley lines, who needs the eye of the first field tiller from Dainsleif, and then they tell us that the Heavenly Principles is still asleep but will awaken soon. In Natlan, everything is status quo. Most of the old dragons from the ancient days have evolved into Saurians that get along and integrated with the tribes of Natlan, each tribe forming a close bond with one of the Saurians. But most of the ancient technology of the dragons has been lost, except for in a few cases where they uncover some of this technology, hence why the Pyro Archon has a motorbike. Mavwika the Pyro Archon during the Cataclysm, who we talked about already, re-emerges in current day, and they continue their pilgrimage to fight back the Abyss and win the war. 500 years ago, however, while Mavwika disappeared, a powerful commander and general by the name of Thrain, cursed with immortality, along with the majority of his platoon, had to flee Khaenri'ah and assisted in Natlan fighting back the monsters in the Abyss, making friends with the tribes here. And he made a promise to the masters of the Nightwind tribe of that era to save Natlan from the Abyss one day. Now he's returned to do just that. The captain's plan is to uncover old dragon technology in a backup plan if the Pyro Archon's plan doesn't work. His plan involves sacrificing Natlan's history for its survival, whereas the Pyro Archon refuses to do that, wanting the legendary heroes that came before to live on through memory and the ley lines, and what's left of their damaged ley lines through the Wyeb. Ultimately though, the captain and the Pyro Archon are able to compromise and work together. Since the Pyro Archon had to use the majority of her power to keep the Abyss at bay, she is now weakened, so the captain along with his soldiers is a much needed help in Natlan. Then the Abyss launches its great attack, which led to both many people and Saurians dying at the
beaucoup
hands
de
of the
morts.
Abyss, including Chaska's sister. The current day heroes along with the Pyro Archon are able to keep the Abyss at bay, blasting a hole right through the false sky, revealing one of the dead moons beyond. The Abyss now taking on the form of the dead Pyro Sovereign, Shukato. With an all-out battle and confrontation, we are able to defeat the Abyss for good, saving Natlan. And the captain using his immortal body, able to stick it to the Shade of Death, acting as an anchor for all the dead souls, both Khaenri'ah and Natlan. Xbalanque, the first Pyro Archon, part of his deal was, if one of his descendants were to ever actually win the war, he could come back for one day and witness the victory, which he does. We then reach the point in the timeline and story where this paradox took place 500 years ago, successfully completing the bootstrap time loop and paradox, with our Abyss sibling having the Atlas to recreate Khaenri'ah completed. The three remaining shades of the Primordial One have a meeting to discuss their fourth colleague, the Shade of Space Asmodee, hinting towards them potentially betraying them and following a new master, which is more than likely the Abyss, but it's hard to say. Maybe a Kevin Kaslana variant, we don't know. And that's when we get to Nodcry. Nodcry being a sub-nation of Snezhnaya, but its own nation altogether. 500 years ago after the Cataclysm, during the War of Vengeance, we talked about the three moon sisters and goddesses that were killed by the dragons for betraying them. Two of the moons themselves were shattered, with the frost moon remaining intact. This led to a reincarnated moon goddess being born after the Cataclysm, and the frost moon scions that are descendants of the angels named this goddess Kutar. But she would ultimately feel confused, isolated from her true source of power with the barrier of the false sky, and being used by the frost moon scions to grant meaningless wishes and solve everyone's problems. So she would leave Nodcry and get recruited by the Fatui, who also wanted to use her for her powers, which they would, leading her to abandon the Fatui, seeking refuge back in Nodcry with the current leader of the Frost Moon Scions, Lauma, keeping her secret and safe. Backtracking a little bit now, you know those 5 sinners? Well, one of them, named Rarier, was given the job by the King of Khaenri'ah to kill an entire species of human, all connected to the Crimson Moon. The king was sort of going insane with abyssal corruption and just the potential insecurity of being overthrown. So he wanted every single descendant of the Crimson Moon slaughtered. And that was Rarier's job. He also had a fiance and seemed like a pretty actually normal guy. I mean, outside the fact that he's committing genocide. And although he hated himself for doing this, he always found reasons to justify his actions like they were an actual threat, even though some of these Crimson Moon people were just kids. It's not until he learns his fiancé is indirectly connected to the Crimson Moon dynasty and he orders him to kill her as well. If you want me to kill kids, that's fine. But the chick I'm banging, are you serious? So then naturally now he betrays the king, and the 5 sinners overthrow the king of Khaenri'ah, but come in contact with the abyssal corruption like we already learned, and henceforth, the Cataclysm. But during those 500 years, Rarier, trying to find his beloved fiancé that went through a portal, had his body shredded apart, being cast in the shadow of the moon, all of his fragments being scattered, and he created an army known as the Wild Hunt that are now also scattered. The Light Keepers are a group that formed to keep the Wild Hunt at bay. But his main fragment is in one of the Light Keepers' lanterns, Flynn's. He needs Kuvaki energy to piece himself back together like the perfect Humpty Dumpty. So he impersonates people in Nodcry to trick them into rebuilding the cannon and blasting himself and being reborn. All the while, Sandrone, the 7th Fatui Harbinger, and the Frost Moon Scions are at each other's throats to claim the moon fragments and influence over Nodcry. Once Rarier pieces himself back together, he realizes he can go straight for Columbina the new moon goddess, and get the bulk of his Kuvaki energy he needs, which forces us to band together with everyone in Nodcry, even including the long-awaited Grandmaster of the Knights of Avonius that's been away since the game started. Realizing that one of the 5 sinners is too powerful to defeat directly, we devise a plan to use his power against him and yeet him through a portal, giving him that Tartaglia treatment, which we successfully do. In order for this to work, we needed the power of the moon goddess. Being that she has no connection to her power source, her strength is depleted, at least giving her a power-up that was comparable to when she was the 3rd Harbinger. We need to seek out the 3rd missing moon fragment of the iridescent moon, which is actually the crimson moon Khaenri'ah used to harness, or at least it's the dead corpse of this moon, corrupted and infused with the abyss. Arlecchino, being a descendant and survivor that fled Khaenri'ah to seek refuge in Fontaine, is able to use her powers in connection to the Crimson Moon to open this doorway so we can power up Columbina. Rare, you're now successfully banished, but will he return? And everything in Nodcry that's happened so far, all of which everything in Nodcry is more than likely been orchestrated by the Doctor behind the scenes, now the Doctor knowing exactly where all the moon fragments are now. And that is the complete timeline
All
and
the
story of
moons
Genshin
in
Impact
one
caught right up to
place.
current game. Some closing remarks before I end the video though. What is Teyvat really? Is Teyvat a simulation just like Amphorius? Everything not real as we perceive it, but all within its own
Ne
little
sois pas
program of
Euphorius,
some
je
sort?
compte jouer au
What is
jeu.
the Hex and Circle's endgame? Do they just mean to protect Teyvat, or are they also hoping to overthrow Celestia and the Heavenly Principles? Where are the remaining sovereigns we haven't met yet? Like the Electro Sovereign, the Animo Sovereign, the Geo Sovereign? Or is Teyvat, like the Hex and Circle like to depict, just a story? A story told by a higher dimensional being? Is Teyvat connected to the rest of the Honkai verse, like Honkai Star Rail and Honkai Impact? Are there actually 2 Abyss twins? We can pick between the 2 when we start the game, but knowing what we know now with the discrepancies in Nodcry with the spaceship, are there actually 2 Abyss twins? Or have we been lied to and tricked this entire time? And finally,
Non,
I
ça
want
je
to say
pense
thank
pas.
you so much
Quand
for
même pas, non?
watching. There was a lot of information I had to disclude, and this video is still more than likely gonna be pushing the half-hour to 45-minute mark. Every nation through every time period, but there was a lot of context and story elements I didn't want to disclude. For example, the story of the Thunderbird, and the whole story of Sarami Island in Inazuma, more
Ouais.
history of the desert in Sumeru. In the future, on every single wrap up the video, Paimon is probably not, but most certainly is the primordial one that
Ah bon?
created the 4 shades, defeated the dragons, and is the true ruler of Celestia.
Bah, c'était le timeline. Ça, c'est quoi? Mon style timeline. Bon, on n'est pas là pour ça. En tout cas, merci pour cette timeline. Donc, maintenant, les théories dont il parle, il avait dit quoi déjà?
45
Ouais, c'était une simulation. En vrai, ça me paraît pas impossible. Quand on voit dans le trailer God's Limit, c'était un différent monde que Teyvat, j'ai l'impression. Et elle s'appelle comment? Shade of Death. Renova a dit à Starot, Why did you bestow history upon them? Pourquoi tu as accordé de l'histoire? Donc, c'est peut-être qu'il y a plusieurs simulations de monde, un truc comme ça. Bon, je suis pas un Lord Genshin, donc je vais pas essayer d'aller en détail. Je dis juste ce que je pense. Et pour les constellations, moi, la plus grande nouvelle, c'était pour les constellations. Si je retrouve la partie. Non, par ici, pas ici. Ici.
Anrian Piero and the Lord Commander of the Fatui and the Harbingers sends his sixth Harbinger Scaramouche to kill the Traveler and investigate the falling stars, which are actual people's fates and constellations literally falling from the sky.
Donc des constellations comme celle de Bénel qu'on a vu à Marduvari. Oh. Donc les constellations ont une explication de l'or aussi. Ah. Il y a beaucoup trop de lore dans Genshin. Bon, on passe à la deuxième vidéo.
Aujourd'hui,
Même si c'est marqué comme ça, j'ai pas encore regardé la vidéo aussi. J'ai peut-être dû appuyer pour voir si c'est en anglais, français, sous-titres ou des trucs comme ça.
on va résumer et expliquer.
Bon, la première vidéo était de Gamer Chronicle. Merci beaucoup pour ta vidéo. Maintenant, on va sur une
Aujourd'hui,
vidéo de Aiynao. Désolé si c'est pas comme ça on prononce. Aiynao.
on va résumer et expliquer le lore de Genshin Impact dans un format très simplifié. Une autre vidéo qui viendra plus tard dans l'année sera consacrée aux détails, donc elle risque d'être sacrément longue au final. Là, l'objectif est simple. Comprendre l'histoire globale de Teyvat sans se perdre dans chaque détail de chaque région. C'est probablement le format le plus adapté pour ceux qui veulent comprendre sans pour autant se tordre le cerveau, car dans le lore de ce jeu, il y a vraiment de quoi péter un câble. Genshin, c'est pas juste un jeu
Je me rends
d'exploration,
compte.
c'est un monde où le ciel impose des lois, où la mémoire peut être réécrite et où plusieurs factions tentent chacune à leur manière de briser l'ordre établi. Teyvat est
Et
un
où on fait
continent
tomber la
organisé
lune
autour
sur
de
ta
7 éléments
tête.
et de 7 nations. Au sommet de cet ordre,
Mais
on
la lune
distingue
est une étoile de
Celestia,
la
une île
mort.
flottante que les habitants associent à la demeure des dieux et à l'ascension des héros. Mais Celestia n'est pas seulement un symbole. Dans l'état connu du lore, Celestia, c'est aussi le centre d'un pouvoir, d'une entité, d'un ensemble de lois qui régissent le monde qu'on appelle l'ordre divin. Cependant, ça n'a pas toujours été le cas. Bien que Teyvat soit aujourd'hui un continent où grouillent différentes divinités, dans une époque lointaine, c'était des dragons qui foulaient la terre et qui décidaient de tout. Et déjà, le ton est donné dans Genshin, la religion, la politique et la cosmologie sont liées. Le ciel n'est pas un simple décor, c'est une autorité sur le monde et sur les 7 éléments. Pour comprendre ce système, il faut remonter avant l'ordre des nations, avant les archons et même avant l'humanité telle qu'on la connaît. Un concept clé qu'il faut comprendre dans l'univers de Genshin, c'est celui des descendeurs. Un descendeur, c'est quelqu'un qui peut transcender les lois de Teyvat. En clair, c'est un être supérieur dont l'existence ne s'inscrit même pas dans le destin du monde. De cette manière, le descendeur est capable de faire à peu près tout, il n'est soumis à absolument aucune loi. Et ce détail devient essentiel quand on comprend le rôle de l'Irminsul, dont on parlera tout à l'heure. L'entité à l'origine de l'ordre divin, qu'on appelle plus communément Phanès, est considéré comme le premier descendeur. Le voyageur, notre protagoniste, est quant à lui le 4e descendeur. Donc le pouvoir qui règne sur Teyvat, le monde du jeu, et le protagoniste partagent une caractéristique inquiétante, ils ne sont pas nés dans le même système que le reste du monde. Genshin raconte aussi une histoire de qui a le droit d'écrire les règles et les lois, et qui doit par nature s'y soumettre. L'Irminsul est décrit comme l'arbre-monde de Teyvat. Il est connecté aux lignes énergétiques et surtout, il sert de réservoir de mémoire. Les lignes énergétiques constituent un immense réseau de racines qui parcourt l'intégralité du monde de Teyvat tout en stockant à la fois les souvenirs de la Terre et de l'énergie, d'où le nom ligne énergétique. Cela signifie que les souvenirs du monde ne sont pas non seulement dans la tête des gens, ils sont aussi stockés dans un système global par le biais des racines connectées à l'arbre-monde. Et ce système tout entier peut être modifié. Par exemple, il est possible de purger du savoir de ce système. Quand cela arrive, le monde s'adapte, les souvenirs changent, les archives sont modifiées, parfois même les documents physiques, afin que la réalité colle à la nouvelle
Mais
version de
pas tous les
l'histoire. Les
documents
événements ont eu lieu, les
physiques.
conséquences restent, mais l'interprétation.
Nicole avait dit que parfois mettre ces genres d'histoires dans des genres de contes pour enfants permet parfois de les garder. Ça donne l'impression que l'immersive a sa propre conscience et que mettre ça en forme d'histoire pour enfants comme ça, c'est comme une sorte de cacher la vérité.
Officielle, elle, est remplacée. C'est un élément fondamental. Le lore de Genshin n'est pas seulement mystérieux parce qu'il manque d'informations, il est mystérieux parce qu'il existe un mécanisme qui peut effacer une vérité. Avec ça en tête, on peut parler de l'ordre
Oh!
moderne. les 7 archons. Les
Donc
7
peut-être il y
sont
a
les dieux
quelque
qui président
chose qui a
les
été
7
effacé
nations.
de tout
Ils
le
sont
monde.
associés à un élément et à un idéal. De ce que l'on sait, ils se sont établis après une période appelée la guerre des archons, un conflit qui s'est terminé 2000 ans avant le réveil du voyageur en Teyvat. Mais attention, la guerre des archons est souvent associée à une seule guerre pour certains joueurs, et c'est normal, le nom parle de lui-même. Mais en vérité, c'est plus complexe que ça.
Il y
La
a
guerre des
plusieurs
archons
guerres.
représente une mosaïque de conflits ayant opposé des centaines, voire des milliers de dieux, différents selon les régions, regroupés sous une même étiquette historique. Le point commun, c'est que cette guerre aboutit à un résultat, 7 sièges divins sont ouverts à Celestia, donc l'île dans le ciel, et les vainqueurs deviennent les archons officiels, des points d'ancrage du système de l'ordre divin. C'était ça la motivation principale derrière la guerre des archons, s'élever au ciel et devenir une divinité supérieure et non pas rester inférieur sur Terre. Et c'est ici qu'apparaît un objet central, le gnosis. Le gnosis, c'est un artefact associé aux archons, leur permettant de raisonner directement avec Celestia. Les gnosis apparaissent comme des pièces d'échecs, un symbolisme assumé. Mais leur nature est bien plus lourde. Les gnosis incarnent le contrôle de l'ordre divin sur Teyvat. C'est la représentation physique des lois établies par le premier descendeur. Les gnosis ont été créés à partir des restes du troisième descendeur. Ainsi, cet artefact si spécial que la tsarine cherche à récupérer sont fabriqués avec des morceaux de cadavres de l'entité qui a précédé le voyageur en termes de statut. On sait désormais que les descendeurs ne sont pas soumis aux lois, donc exploiter leurs particularités pour créer des objets entraîne forcément des enjeux de taille. Donc on a une structure où le ciel fabrique des clés de gouvernance, donc les gnosis, ces clés déclenchent des luttes entre les dieux, donc la guerre des archons, et l'ordre qui en sort organise tout le continent, donc l'ordre divin actuel. C'est une manière très simple de voir la guerre des archons, il s'agit d'un processus de centralisation du pouvoir. Et ce processus a pris fin environ il y a
De la
2000 ans, quand le dernier
politique.
siège a été réclamé par une divinité, après avoir été considéré comme vainqueur des conflits ayant eu lieu sur son territoire. Après la guerre des archons, le monde se structure, les nations s'installent réellement autour des 7 archons justement, et les idéaux deviennent des institutions. Mondstadt a adopté la liberté en suivant Barbatos, l'archon Anémo, Liyue a adopté les contrats en suivant Morax, l'archon Géo, Inazuma a adopté l'éphémère en suivant Baal, l'archon Électro, Sumeru a adopté la sagesse en suivant Rukkhadevata, l'archon
Éphémère.
Dendro, Fontaine a adopté la justice en suivant Egeria, l'archon Hydro, Natlan a adopté la guerre en suivant Jbalanque, l'archon Pyro, et Snezhnaya a adopté visiblement l'amour en suivant le Tsarbeli, l'archon Cryo. Il ne reste aujourd'hui que 2 des archons
Sarbelli.
d'origine, il s'agit de Barbatos et de Morax. Les autres archons, quant à eux, ont été remplacés après leur mort. Un autre point essentiel dans la compréhension de ce monde, c'est les yeux divins. Même si les humains pensent souvent que
Avant de continuer, je vais faire une petite recherche sur Sarbelli. Hmm. Bon, je vois rien. Vous savez quelque chose, dites-moi en commentaire.
que les archons donnent les yeux divins, en réalité c'est bien plus complexe que ça, puisqu'ils ne contrôlent pas réellement cette distribution. On a parlé brièvement des dragons au début, et c'est normal, puisque leur pouvoir a été dérobé, puis confié aux archons pour qu'ils contrôlent eux-mêmes les éléments. En Teyvat, on ne peut pas contrôler à 100% un élément, tel que le pyro ou l'anémo. Pour le faire, il faut être en possession de ce qu'on appelle l'autorité élémentaire. Cette autorité appartenait aux dragons, et c'est elle qui permet justement l'attribution des yeux divins. On dit que ceux qui en reçoivent un se voient accorder un fragment d'autorité, ce qui donc leur permet d'utiliser en partie l'élément associé. Mais les archons, bien qu'ils disposent chacun d'une autorité sur leur propre élément, ne décident pas de manière consciente qui et pourquoi un mortel reçoit un œil divin. Cela fait partie d'une règle qui les dépasse, établie par l'ordre divin. Autrement dit, même les dieux locaux, les archons sont insérés contre leur gré dans un système qu'ils ne contrôlent pas. Mais pendant que la surface vit avec ce nouvel ordre, une autre civilisation se développe à l'écart de ce même système. Khaenri'ah est l'un des noms les plus importants du
Khaenri'ah,
lore.
c'est
C'est
pour
une
ça qu'il
civilisation
prononce en
ancienne et
français.
souterraine située
Khaenri'ah.
profondément sous Sumeru et
Je
surtout
disais
une nation
Khaenri'ah.
qui existe sans l'influence directe des dieux. Cette indépendance change tout. Khaenri'ah symbolise une humanité qui pourrait prospérer en dehors de l'ordre créé par Celestia. Elle développe ses technologies, ses machines et une alchimie propre qu'on appelle l'art de Kémia. Et au fil du temps, Khaenri'ah se retrouve lié à un autre type de puissance qu'on appelle l'abîme. L'abîme, c'est une force naturelle qui existe dans l'univers l'univers. Le problème, c'est que la nature de l'abîme, c'est la destruction. Donc, s'il n'est pas contrôlé, l'abîme peut littéralement détruire une planète. Voyant cette force comme une solution pour échapper aux règles de l'ordre divin, Khaenri'ah a commencé à l'utiliser malgré sa potentielle dangerosité. Et là, on arrive au point de rupture du monde moderne, le cataclysme. Le cataclysme est présenté comme un ensemble de conflits autour de deux idées, l'irruption et l'expansion de l'abîme, et la destruction de Khaenri'ah par les dieux et l'ordre divin. L'ordre exact des événements reste ambigu, mais le tableau global est clair. Des forces abyssales se déversent, notamment à cause du roi de Khaenri'ah, qui a beaucoup trop exploité l'abîme, atteignant un point de non-retour, ravageant Teyvat, et pour éviter que cette menace ne se propage, Khaenri'ah a été détruite. Mais en vérité, le résultat, ce n'est pas seulement une nation détruite, c'est un monde traumatisé où des survivants subissent des malédictions, des rancunes se transforment en idéologie, les relations entre Archon et Célestia se fissurent et deux grandes factions antagonistes naissent en réaction. L'ordre de l'abîme et les Fatui sont établis comme une réponse aux actions de Célestia lors de cette période. Le problème de l'époque actuelle, ce n'est donc pas un mal mystérieux sorti de nulle part, c'est la conséquence d'un événement politique et nécessaire. À l'époque, l'histoire des jumeaux voyageurs rejoint celle de ce monde. Le protagoniste et son jumeau sont des voyageurs intermondes. Leur monde d'origine a été détruit par l'abîme justement, et depuis, ils errent dans la mer d'étoiles et finissent par atteindre Teyvat après un très long périple dans leur vaisseau. Le jumeau, lui, a eu le temps de visiter Khaenri'ah
Avec
juste
tout
avant sa
ça,
destruction,
j'ai
donc
bien
lors du
envie de voir
cataclysme,
un
il a pu voir de ses
crossover
propres
en
yeux la
Starry et
catastrophe. Le
Genshin.
voyageur, quant à lui, était resté en profond sommeil.
Avec tous ces liens qu'il faut comme ça, ne pas faire un crossover serait vraiment dommage. Sachant qu'il y aura bientôt même un crossover en Castarel et puis Zézézé.
La menace grandissante, ils tentent de quitter ce monde, mais sont interceptés par une déesse très particulière. Elle se nomme Asmodée, et il s'agit d'une ombre de l'ordre divin. Une ombre, c'est une entité originaire de Phanès, le premier descendeur, qui se doit de faire perdurer son propre concept dans le monde de Teyvat. Il y a la vie, la mort, le temps et l'espace. Asmodée est l'ombre qui régit le concept de l'espace. Et c'est là que l'intrigue principale se met en place. Un jumeau se réveille dans le présent, l'autre a vécu un parcours particulier et a vu la vérité de ce monde, et a fini par s'aligner avec l'ordre de l'abîme qu'on va développer juste après. Ce qui rend cette divergence si puissante, c'est la nature du voyageur, parce que c'est un descendeur. Comme l'Irminsul ne garde pas de traces des descendeurs, le voyageur est aussi un témoin privilégié, quelqu'un qui peut se souvenir de tout, même quand le monde oublie. L'ordre de l'abîme est décrit comme une force organisée, hostile aux nations, mais également aux divinités. L'ordre cherche en premier lieu à reconstruire la nation de Khaenri'ah, et cela passe par plusieurs étapes, parfois très coûteuses. Les fils du destin ou encore le métier à tisser du destin devient une opération centrale. C'est une tentative de créer un nouvel ordre, de manipuler les lignes énergétiques et d'agir sur les mécanismes mêmes qui écrivent la mémoire du
Ah,
monde.
c'est
C'est
la traduction
absolument
française de
phénoménal.
Loom
Si
of,
Célestia
de
gouverne
Loom
par
of
les lois et par
Fate.
la mémoire, alors l'ordre de l'abîme tente de construire une machine capable de rivaliser
Mhm.
avec ce pouvoir. L'autre antagoniste majeur est l'organisation des Fatui, loyale à la Tsarine, l'archon-cryo actuel de la région de Snezhnaya. Sans entrer dans le détail de tous les exécuteurs, à vrai dire j'ai déjà fait une vidéo dessus juste là, l'idée de l'organisation est claire. Les
Ah bon?
Fatui
Est-ce que
étendent
c'est...
leur influence.
Oui, c'est elle que je regarde. Non! Oui,
Et leur
c'est elle que je
objectif
regarde
central,
après.
c'est la
Fais
collecte
comme
des
si vous n'avez
gnosis.
rien
Si
vu.
les gnosis sont des objets liés à l'ordre divin, alors les collecter, c'est rassembler les pièces maîtresses du système qui maintient l'ordre actuel. Donc probablement, les briser reviendrait à briser l'ordre. On comprend alors que les deux grands ennemis du jeu ne visent pas la même cible de la même manière. Un des éléments les plus importants pour comprendre l'état actuel du monde, c'est cette notion de trône divin lié aux autorités élémentaires. C'est un élément central qui a été mis en avant dans la quête d'Archon de Fontaine. On parlait plutôt justement des autorités élémentaires qui appartenaient aux dragons avant l'émergence du premier descendeur. Ce qu'il faut retenir, c'est que les autorités élémentaires ont été stockées dans les trônes divins, les mêmes trônes que ceux qui se sont ouverts à l'époque de la guerre des Archons, entraînant la naissance de tous les conflits. S'asseoir sur un trône divin confère l'autorité de l'élément associé. Autrement dit, ça rend la divinité surpuissante. Mais le twist est là, un trône divin peut être détruit, comme nous l'a prouvé Alors. Quand cela se produit, l'autorité élémentaire retourne à son détenteur originel, c'est-à-dire le dragon antique. La destruction du trône hydro a eu lieu à cette période qu'on vit actuellement,
Non!
où l'ordre divin est inactif. Depuis le désastre de Khaenri'ah, le premier descendeur n'a montré aucun signe de vie. De ce fait, c'est visiblement le meilleur moment pour frapper pour les différentes factions du monde qui convoitent justement cette place place de dirigeant de Teyvat. Et la
Ouais.
plupart des événements, des quêtes d'Archon, du lore du jeu, tournent autour de cette réalité. Un affrontement contre les règles célestes, dans l'espoir de pouvoir abolir des lois qui sont bien loin de plaire à tout le monde. Nous sommes à l'aube d'une immense rébellion, et encore plus quand on sait que Snezhnaya arrive très vite. À ce stade, on peut résumer Genshin de la sorte, bien que ce soit très loin de représenter tout ce qu'il y a à savoir, disons qu'il y a le principal. Celestia est un centre de pouvoir associé à l'ordre divin, Phanes, le premier descendeur, qui gouverne Teyvat par des lois quasiment incontournables. Les 7 archons représentent une architecture politique du continent, stabilisée après la guerre des archons. Les Gnosis sont des objets de liaison avec Celestia, et leur origine est liée aux descendeurs. L'Irminsul stocke la mémoire du monde et peut être modifiée, la vérité est donc un enjeu politique. Khaenri'ah est la grande anomalie historique, une nation sans dieu détruite il y a environ 500 ans. L'abîme et les fatuis émergent comme des réponses face à la violence de l'ordre divin. Le voyageur, descendeur et l'anomalie narrative, un témoin hors système capable de conserver des vérités que le monde oublie. Et c'est ici qu'on comprend le cœur du récit. Ce n'est pas seulement une guerre de puissance, c'est une guerre sur qui possède l'autorité légitime, le ciel, la terre, les dragons, les humains ou bien les étrangers.
Ok. Ça nous fait la deuxième vidéo qu'on a terminée. Du coup, on va s'arrêter là pour cette deuxième vidéo. Bien sûr, comme je l'ai dit, on va avoir les liens de ces deux vidéos qu'on a vues en commentaire, de Gamer Chronicle et de Aiynao. Je vous remercie très bien pour cette vidéo. Merci à vous aussi d'avoir regardé ma vidéo. N'oubliez pas de laisser un pouce bleu, de laisser un commentaire sur peut-être vos théories. Ah bon? Moi, je suis encore penché sur la théorie que Teyvat est une simulation. De la manière tout est lié au lore, tout a une raison, ça m'a l'air trop parfait. Et pour quelque chose de parfait, je vois pas d'autre chose qu'une simulation. Ça, ce qui me ramène aussi sur le trailer de God's Limit. Ça fait comme s'il y a plusieurs mondes de ce genre. Même si le monde qu'ils ont montré, je pense pas que ce soit Teyvat, ça avait l'air un peu similaire à Teyvat. Donc peut-être le Teyvat où on est actuellement, ce n'est pas le Teyvat original. Il y a peut-être plusieurs copies de Teyvat. Et puis dans la manière dont on va demander pourquoi Starot leur a donné l'histoire, je me demande de quel genre d'histoire elle parle. L'histoire des jumeaux, l'histoire à ce monde ou bien un genre d'histoire qu'on ne connaît pas encore. Bon, en tout cas, donnez-moi vos pensées en commentaire. Abonnez-vous, laissez un pouce bleu. Et on se retrouve dans 1 ou 2 jours pour la prochaine vidéo. Bye!